which does so much damage.
And there's, of course, Bucket's most glaring failure, which is to save Lady Dedlock, you know, and so conveniently enough, he misreads the situation, the evidence, so that, you know, he doesn't get there in time to save her.
Right.
All kinds of connections between this Pictures from Italy, these passages, and Little Dorrit as well. That same sort of nostalgia for this sort of privileged position in quarantine, right? How Meagles looks back and thinks about how those are some of the best times in my life. Something that one wonders whether we'll look back and think those things in a few years. There's also the sort of colonial aspect of, you know, both Clennam and Meagles, and then of course the wool that's coming back in Pictures from Italy is coming from the East, right? So that's one of the sort of systemic reasons for that protection of that microcosm of home, right?
I'll take this opportunity to go back to the passage that we skipped over then, from the journalism. So I saw that not one miserable wretch breathed out his poisoned life in the deepest cellar of the most neglected town, but from the surrounding atmosphere, some particles of his infection were borne away, charged with heavy retribution on the general guilt. So in this passage, Dickens is conflating a wretch as being infected with being poisoned. So there's a kind of culpability in it. Why do you think Dickens links these two contaminants? And how does his portrait of contagion here illuminate the class politics of the current pandemic?
I just want to start by pointing out that critics often say that Dickens got disease transmission wrong because of the way in which he was invested in miasma theories of contagion. You know, interestingly enough, all of us with our face masks, you know, and the recent discussion of contaminated air in confined spaces does seem to bring back to us the theory of miasma, because in fact, the air is dangerous to breathe under certain circumstances. So I do think that this notion of a poisoned life sort of brings us back to not just miasma, but forward to our current circumstances too, and the ways in which disease is in fact spread among those in a confined space.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lillian, and I've been thinking about miasma a lot too, because it seems kind of to define or describe what we're dealing with right now. Also, I love this quote because of that connection between being infected and being poisoned, which suggests that being infected isn't just like a chance happening. It's the deliberate, well, it's the result of very poor social systems and unequal social systems that poison almost deliberately those who get infected.
Like a crime has been committed.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'd like to add to that we, we post-germ theory people tend to think of diseases as being very separate. That wouldn't have made as much sense to mid-Victorians who thought that diseases could change one to another, and that they were based in a sort of general unhealthiness that could then manifest in different ways. The analogy, one might think of something like Flint, Michigan. If you're drinking water that is literally poisoning you, you are more likely to get sick from other things because your general health is undermined.
Right.
And in that sense, you can't make a kind of, you can't put quarantine walls between different diseases because they all interact in the general health of the organism. And that would have made sense to Victorians.
Well, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, this is part and parcel of all of the current conversations too, right? I mean, the coronavirus affects people differently if they have underlying conditions. There is perfectly legitimate concern about protesters who have been exposed to tear gas, right? Which is an irritant to the respiratory system. I apologize if you hear a lot of buzzing in the background. My neighbor has decided this is a good time to cut his lawn. So I don't know how much of that the microphone is picking up, but this is, this is part and parcel of the way that these sort of things overlap and interlock and aggravate one another. And a lot of that is, of course, class-based, right? I mean, you're more likely to be exposed to these things if you are living in a poor environment, if you are living very closely, sort of crunched together with other people. So it's all there.
There's also, I mean, I'm interested in this idea of culpability, the idea of poisoned as opposed to infected, and that sense of blame. And it's actually like the miasma theory. It's a sense where Dickens goes in and out of relevance. That, I mean, Dickens is writing this to try to put blame on people and say, who's responsible for this? And yet now, in a way, it's gone the other way, where politicians are struggling with COVID-19 because there isn't someone to blame. There isn't a group you can go, it's their fault. There isn't the usual scapegoat tactic you can use to go, well, there's our enemy, and we will now blame them for this.
Fed up with Trump.
Well, unfortunately, this is now the new danger, that with the protest, that's now going to be used as it's their fault. They came out to protest, and now they've spread it. Which is hugely unfair when people are going to the beach and everything as well. But there's a sense that what politicians have so long used is the idea of a scapegoat group, someone who can be blamed for it conveniently, and let's put aggression onto them. And with COVID-19 as the invisible enemy, and all the war metaphors we've used to try to describe the virus, there's a need to find culpability for what is ultimately, as I say, an amoral agent that can't be, defined by the normal rules of rhetoric and politics there as well. So if we're talking about, in case of COVID-19 being poisoned, there's actually more of the politicians will be keen to do that rather than actually the public, who are keen to see it as more like a general concern for everyone.
But there is indeed a kind of racist narrative about COVID, especially here in the States.
Yeah.
Either blaming it on, both blaming it on China, but some blaming it on some kind of, innate cultural practices, and then a much more paranoid theory, which is being promoted by people who, actually have some power, that it is a bioweapon. So we are seeing those. I mean, it sounds insane because it is insane, but we are seeing those narratives play out.
Yeah, and so in the case of Dickens here, we can see this culpability as being a positive change for social good, like, for trying to identify whose fault is this, rather than the refrain of it's nobody's fault, saying, well, it's someone's fault, it's do something about it. Actually, now that search to blame has become a far more negative impact on the way we deal with this virus.
Right.
Yeah, and the fault that nobody is owning, and that they should. Yeah, like, Trump will blame China and that it was a biological weapon, but like, will he blame his own social system that has, the poor living in crowded conditions, just like Tom all Alone, so inadequate access to healthcare, jobs that put them on the front line, and they have no choice about that, etc. It's like, I have the luxury, I can work from home most of the time, but the facilities people in my building, they don't have that luxury. They have to be here every day. So there's a lot of blame that could be attributed, but it's not getting attributed because it would have to be criticizing our basic capitalist system, and people are afraid to do that, except for Bernie Sanders, and look what happened to him.
Yeah.
I just want to jump in there quickly because we're coming to the end of the session, but I want to give a couple of minutes for some questions from the chat. So thank you very much to all of our participants, and I think we could continue this conversation all day. There's so much to say about it, and so much relevance that I think shows the relevance of Dickens for now very well. If people, I'll stop screen sharing so I can see if people raise their hands, but we've got a question from Louise in the chat. Is, do we need metaphor to process illness in fiction and in reality?
Yes, I guess. I think it's helpful. I mean, as I was saying a moment ago, this idea of how we're using war metaphors frequently as a way of trying to respond to this. I think the answer is no, we shouldn't need it, and yet somehow, obviously, we do need it as a way of mobilizing it, of making sense of it, of creating a narrative around it. And going back to that idea of Bleak House and the way that it is ultimately a safe narrative, stories are great for making sense of the insensible, and of trying to contain it and control it that way. So it starts with metaphors, of trying to put it in a way that we can understand, because then it feels something we can actually do something about. Whereas I say the reality is that the COVID-19 is not something that we really understand in a traditional narrative way. There is no narrative thread to this. It is unpredictable, and that's truly terrifying.
It gives Contagion a greater rhetorical power and greater political power when it's, you know, when it resonates metaphorically. So, which is very double-edged, needless to say, because it can be misused symbolically, you know, as to dangerous ends, as we've been discussing, in terms of the sort of racist use of Contagion, particularly in the States.
The problem that oh, go ahead, Pamela.
I was just going to say, language is intrinsically, to some extent, metaphorical. It's very hard to get away from metaphor. It's perhaps more dangerous to have metaphors that are so hidden or so normalized we don't understand them as metaphor, because I think those are much more apt to hide from us how they are a figure or a way of thinking through reality, rather than a straightforward description of a reality.
I will say that I do think this Dickens's metaphors as associated with illness are a lot more useful than our current ones, in the sense that the most common current metaphor is that we're in a war, that this is a war, that somehow this can be resolved in warlike fashion. I mean, you know, as if we're going to send our military in to take care of the virus. And well, and we're sending them in to take care of the protesters, but I don't know that we're sending them in to take care of the virus. And, you know, the problem, of course, is that I wish that we had a more useful Dickensian metaphor, perhaps, that where what we were really sort of calling attention to was the underlying systematic issues that produce the conditions in which COVID-19 can spread in the way that it has, and the way that it can disproportionately impact the poor or the non-white in the way that it has. And we don't, I don't see in our current discourse that metaphor yet. I only see the military metaphor, which I think is very unhelpful.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for that. It's a really, really stimulating discussion, and hopefully people will continue to talk about this in the chat and in Slack, but I now have to bring this session to an end. So please join me either silently or in the chat or clapping by thanking our 6 speakers. Thank you very much.